Hello everyone, my name is Daniel and I'm back. Today I'm going to talk about Messiah 2030 and critique it, test it against scripture, and present a very compelling case of why this year, 2025, is not only a Jubilee year, it's the first year of the Millennial reign. So dig in, this is going to be an exciting video. All right, so why the Millennial reign started in 2025 and a critical review of Messiah 2030. Now, I have a lot of charts and pictures here and a lot of references in the text. You can find a link to this Medium post in the description on this video if you'd like to follow along or get a better view of some of the charts. So let's start with Messiah 2030. It's an extremely well-produced multi-part series that presents a grand unified theory or interpretation of scripture pointing to Yeshua's return in 2030 after a 3.5-year tribulation. Videos, it's like a 3 or 4 part series. Each part is a couple hours. So it'll overwhelm most people with a dizzying array of facts that take an enormous amount of effort to review. So if you're going to do more than just watch, you're going to go and check up on it. It's a lot of work. So fact-checking it could take even longer than the video itself, so this is just going to be a Reader's Digest version of what I consider to be the core fundamental issues with Messiah 2030. Of course, the reason of doing this critique is to highlight implications for us today and not just a bunch of academic debating of meaningless interpretations of ancient history. If you buy the logic of Messiah 2030, then you are at risk of being taken by surprise in the sudden destruction and potentially remembering the Sabbath on the wrong day, among other issues, but that's the two big ones. Now, obviously, you're not going to be in danger of hell for observing the Sabbath on the wrong day if it was unintentional and you are observing some kind of Sabbath and doing your best to understand and seek the truth. But I presume that we are all here because we want to serve Yah and walk in his ways as best we can. And so we study to show ourselves approved. We study these things out and test everything, right? So that's one of the things that 119 Ministries is always saying is test everything. Well, we're going to test their teaching. So let's look at the big picture. And this is the 7,000 year timeline. A day is 1,000 years. They map it all out relative to the days of Genesis. I agree with this big picture. So we are in agreement with that, although the details like 2030 and 30 CE are what we're going to be talking about. So now this is the heart of their conclusion of all that is that the Daniel's 70th week is been split 3.5 years of the first coming, 3.5 years of the second coming, starting at the desolation of the abomination, or sorry, they call it the abomination of desolation, in spring of 2027. So that's when they're expecting things to kick off, and until then we are not in any real danger according to their theory. So you can see the issues. If something could happen this year, you're going to have your guard down for the next 2 years if you buy this. So we need to test it and see what we've got. So now the sacrifices were taken away in 598 BC, and the Dome of the Rock was set up in the 1290th year, which aligns with the 3-month overlap in the Islamic year of 72. And that year is engraved on the Dome of the Rock. So the next 1,335 years end in spring of 2028. So if you include its desolation, the destruction of the Dome of the Rock, within the 1,335 years, then it will be desolated somewhere between spring of 2027 and spring of 2028. If if you put its desolation at the very end, it's 2028. So that's a point here where this is potentially an early date for that. Now, when I read Revelation, I see that it suggests that it's made desolate after 1,260 days of the two witnesses. And since the two witnesses do not begin until after the sudden destruction in the fall of Babylon, two things, which haven't happened yet, but they could be here next week, the earliest this could land is 1,260 days from today, which would be fall of 2028. So for this reason, I currently consider the first year after the 1,335 years as the year in which it is made desolate, and that could be as late as Perm 2029. So I think I didn't see the part of the video because I watched the third part, but I don't remember exactly how they derived this date, but this is how I derive the desolation of the abomination. And that's by interpreting Daniel 11 with the proper tenses in the Hebrew that says from the time the sacrifices were taken away, past tense from Daniel, going to the setting up of the abomination. The Dome of the Rock is 1,290 years. And then from there until its desolation is 1,335. So that's straight from Daniel 9. And so here's the chart I showed at the top. I'm going to talk about this briefly because how you understand Daniel 9 can dramatically frame the entire discussion. So if you look at Smith's literal translation of Daniel 9:24, this is taken straight from Bible Hub. Instead of 70 weeks, which NIV puts the word weeks in quotes to indicate that, hey, there's something weird here. Hebrew there is actually 70-70 when you remove the vowel points, which weren't added until 400 AD. So we have 70 were divided or decreed upon your people and upon the holy city to close the transgression, to seal up the sins, to expiate iniquity, to bring in eternal justice, and to seal up the vision and prophecy and anoint the Holy of Holies. Well, 70-70 is very different than 70 weeks. And we know that not everything was or could be completed in 70 weeks. And so 70-70, well, that's 4,900 years. That's a big length of time. That's one question. Second, who is thy people? This is talking to Daniel. I'm going to submit to you that thy people is the seed of Abraham, because that's who Daniel is a descendant, right? All the Jews, all of Israel, all of the church, we are considered the seed of Abraham. So you could understand this as saying 77s are decreed upon the seed of Abraham, in which everything that's talked about in the prophets is fulfilled. So that includes the millennial reign. So if we assume 7,000 years, and we take that 4,900 years at the very end, bump it up against the end there, where does it start? Well, that would be 2,100 years from creation, exactly 1876 BC at the covenant of Abraham. So the very covenant that creates the promise to the seed of Abraham going to the end of the millennial reign is exactly 4,900 years long. And that is a literal reading of Daniel 9:24 without the vowel points. And how did I get this date, you might ask? Well, we take all the evidence we have for 1406 BC Jordan River crossing, which is taken by in 966 BC, Solomon started building the temple, and we have secular and archaeological evidence, records from many different kingdoms that all point and reference and pinpoint that year. We also have celestial signs and other things. In Kings, the book of Kings tells us to go back 480 years. That'll take you to the Exodus, right? And when they were leaving in the Exodus, we were told that it was 430 years that they sojourned in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan. And That's the Septuagint version of Exodus 12:40. And we can connect that to the covenant with Abraham with Galatians 3:16. And now the promises were made to Abraham and to his offspring. And this is what I mean. The law, which came 430 years afterward. So when did they get the law? At Exodus, 430 years after the covenant with Abraham. So, since this is a well-established date, these others are direct numbers that are confirmed in the Septuagint and in Galatians. We know that they were in the wilderness for 40 years. We have very strong confidence that this is a perfect match for the seed of Abraham. Now, there's another way of interpreting this, because 70/70 is really the word seven plural, right? Seven, or two or more sevens is what it is. And so normally that would be, 10 is a group of sevens, but a jubilee or 7 sevens is also another type of group of 7. So you can read this as 70 times 49, or 70 jubilee. Right? And so if you take 70 jubilee from the Jordan River crossing, 2025 is a jubilee year. So it's the jubilee year, which is the first year of the millennial reign, according to this timeline that fits perfectly with all the evidence I've gathered over the past couple years. So this is the framework that I'm approaching it and testing Messiah 2030 against, because their claims are very different than this interpretation. So, Messiah 2030 is missing this 77 interpretation from Daniel 9:24, and that changes everything. So there's just no room to move. It perfectly matches the time frame of seed of the covenant to the end of all history that we've been told about in 7,000 years. So when Messiah 2030 puts the Jubilee year 5 years from now, in 2030, we've got a problem. So I've kind of covered that already. So let's talk about what Scripture defines as a Jubilee. Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you enter the land I am going to give you, the land itself must observe a Sabbath to the Lord. For 6 years sow your fields, 6 years prune your vineyards and gather the crops, but in the 7th year the land is to have a year of Sabbath rest. So anywhere in Scripture where you see the land is resting, it's a reference to this Sabbath rest every 7 years. So a Sabbath to the Lord. Do not sow your fields or prune your vineyards. Now you're supposed to count off 7 Sabbath years. All right, so 7 times 7 years, so that the 7 Sabbath years amount to a period of 49 years. There's your definition of a Jubilee. Then have the trumpet sound everywhere on the 10th day of the 7th month, Day of Atonement. On the Day of Atonement, sound the trumpet throughout your land, consecrate the 50th year, and proclaim liberty throughout the land and to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. Each of you is to return to your family and to your own clan. So on the Jubilee year, you return to your family and your own clan. In the year of Jubilee, everyone is to return to their own property. So that's the prophetic future. So if that's right, and this is the Jubilee year, then this year we return to our property. And this is a big one. So we are told to start counting when we enter the land he is giving us. And there are 2 points of time that we enter this land. Once when they cross the Jordan River, and again when he gathers us from the nations and returns us to the promised land during the millennial reign. So it turns out that 70 times 49 years from 1406 makes 2025 a Jubilee year at the very start of the millennial reign. Both years are Jubilee years. So this is where we have a major problem with Messiah 2030 and the 50-year Jubilee cycle. So they claim a Jubilee cycle is 50 years and that the first year doesn't overlap with the 50th year. And that's based on an interpretation that the 50th year shall be a Jubilee for you. So they're taking a Jubilee as the entire 50, and then you start over counting again with 1 instead of the 51st year being the second year of the next one. So that's their interpretation. Now, whose interpretation is correct? You need to test it. And the way I tested this is I know that the start of the millennial reign is with the Jubilee, and when they enter the land is a Jubilee, and the distance between them, the math checks out. That's pretty strong testing. But this math doesn't work at all if it's 50 years. You don't get 70 Jubilees with 50 years because it's going to be another 70 years from now. Right? So 2095 is how long it would take. So that's what we really need to test. Is it 50 or is it 49? And that's a really big problem with Messiah 2030, in my opinion. So the Book of Jubilees supports the counting of 49 cycles, but they dismiss Jubilees as it's not Scripture. And I don't think it's Scripture either, but I do think it is solid evidence that that's how this was interpreted way back when. So now, if 2025 is a Jubilee year, then it should have been announced throughout the land on Day of Atonement 2024, which it was, as Isaiah 61, which read nationwide on ads using Pandora and Spotify all day on the Day of Atonement, proclaiming the 70th Jubilee. So let's look at the critical conclusions of Messiah 2030. And if you can undermine or debunk any one of these, then their entire framework that they have comes tumbling down. So they put a lot of effort into claiming that Herod the Great died in 4 BC, and this is the standard consensus if you just ask Google what it was. But I'm going to show that it was Josephus and all of the historians through countless cross-references show that it was 1 BC, not 4 BC. They claim that Yeshua declared a Jubilee in Luke 4. So they're saying that there was a Jubilee somewhere around 30 AD. And they're actually saying the Jubilee was declared 3.5 years before the Jubilee year. Now, that's against Torah, because Torah says you declare the Jubilee the year before, right? So 6 months before the start of the Jubilee on the Day of Atonement is when you declare it. And they're claiming it took place 3.5 years before. They're saying that Yeshua was killed on a Wednesday, that first fruits is not always on the 16th of the month, that he was raised in 30 AD, that Jubilee is 50 years, not 49, and that his ministry was 3.5 years. Those are all things that they are assuming to be true and are trying to demonstrate with facts. These are all things that I think are false and can demonstrate and prove otherwise. And any one of them is sufficient to bring down the entire house of cards. So that's a lot of things that they have to get right and be right on. So one of the dangers we all face when we come up with these giant models of how everything works is we start to reject anything that doesn't fit into our existing model, right? So they'll point out that they've got 66 points that all interlock and support, and so you can't budge. And they're absolutely right. You can't budge. You dislodge any single one of them, and all the rest no longer hold up. And that's the danger with using the fact that it fits into your story as evidence that it's probably true. It's just evidence that you made it fit. It's not evidence. And it's circular reasoning. You have to prove each thing independently, not just because it fits with your other theory. So let's look at the assertion that did Yeshua declare a Jubilee in Luke 4 reading of Isaiah 61? Because according to the timetable of 1406 and 2025, the closest Jubilee to Yeshua's ministry was 16 AD or 65 AD. So there shouldn't be a Jubilee during the middle of his ministry, but they're claiming he proclaimed one. So I already read the definition of Jubilee up above. Deuteronomy, at the end of every 7 years, you shall grant a release. This is the manner of the release. Every creditor shall release what he has lent to his neighbor. He shall not exact his neighbor, his brother, because the Lord's release has been proclaimed. So, in addition to the land getting a rest, every 7 years, you're supposed to set all your slaves free, all your servants free, and forgive all debts. Every 7 years, not just on Jubilee years. In fact, a Jubilee is all about the return of the land and the inheritance. It is not about debt forgiveness. The debt forgiveness happens every 7 years. So when Yeshua reads, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives," those who are slaves, "recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed," basically those under a debt burden, "and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Now, this year of the Lord's favor is an ambiguous term. I'd say anytime you're getting your debts forgiven, he's showing you favor. But here's the critical thing. He says, "This scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." That means right now it is fulfilled. This tells me that he has to read this on the Day of Atonement on the 7th year of a Shemitah cycle. And that's independent of whether or not it's a Jubilee, right? It's the 7th year of the 7th week of a Jubilee. And Messiah 2030 is asserting that he's reading this 3.5 years before the start of the Jubilee. That this is the first thing he does before he even turns 30 years old. And I'm going to demonstrate several reasons why that's impossible for him to do it before he turns 30. It would be breaking Torah. And they're claiming, 5 days isn't really, we're just bending the rules a little bit. But it's also impossible to declare it 3.5 years in advance because the Torah requires it be proclaimed in your hearing on the year before. So it'd have to be 29 AD if 30 AD is a Jubilee. Now, it turns out 29 AD is the 7th year on the continuous cycle that I follow from 1406 BC. So that is the year that this was proclaimed, but there's a side effect. If that's the year that this is proclaimed, then everything that happens after the Nazareth event has to happen before the cross. And if the cross is in 30 AD, then it has to happen in 6 months. And that's 6 winter months. So that just doesn't fit with Scripture. It's impossible for 29 AD to be the year that he's reading this and the cross to be in 30 AD. So Messiah 2030 places a lot of weight on 30 AD to 2,000 years later. And we now have evidence from the Shemitah cycle that suggests that that's an impossibility. And they could simply update their interpretation to say that it's being read on 29. But now they got all these other problems. So Messiah 23rd also makes the claim that Moses, being 120 years old when he entered the Promised Land, is a prophetic connection to 120 Jubilees from creation. So they're saying 120 Jubilees times 50 is 6,000 years. That all has to line up. And so that's a really big reason why they're putting a lot of efforts. And they basically show that a year can be represented as a Jubilee. So Jeremiah's 70 years could be 70 Jubilees. and Daniel 9, 77s is provided to clarify the 70 years of Jeremiah. So, we're seeing that they've sort of already bought into some of the framework of a year being a symbol of a jubilee, just like a day is a symbol of a year, talking prophetic terms. So let's look at this claim that it took place 3.5 years before the actual jubilee. So the Torah requires that you be 30 years old before you can pertain or do anything in the tabernacle or the synagogue. So from 30 years old up to 50, all who can come on duty to do the work in the tent of meeting. And this verse establishes that that's when they began their service. John the Baptist began when he was 30. And then we have several verses in Numbers that repeat this requirement in various situations. So it's well established that a priest can only serve in the temple after they are 30 years old. Yeshua cannot violate that Torah in order to speak in the Torah before his 30th birthday. But here's the other interesting thing. What did Yeshua say right after he read Isaiah? He tells them that you're going to say, why don't you do here in Nazareth what we heard that you have done in other synagogues in Capernaum? And Luke 4 says that he had been traveling around speaking in synagogues and had grown in fame throughout the whole land. So everybody knew of him, and they knew of his miracles before he gets to Nazareth. And then Yeshua's own words reference that he has been doing things in Capernaum before he got there. So this isn't a situation of, 5 days will cut him some slack. Because in order for this, for Yeshua's statements to make sense and the book of Luke to be true, he would have had to be doing this for at least a month or two. But Messiah 2030 claims that he was baptized at the end of the 5th month or start of the 6th month, about 40 days before this, goes into the wilderness, fast, comes out, and then goes straight to here, and this is where his ministry begins. That's their claim, and yet they do acknowledge that he did these other things beforehand. So there's a contradiction in that acknowledgement, and there's all those other things he did well before he was 30, so he couldn't be speaking in synagogues before then, and now you've got a problem. So what happens if you let's just assume that maybe he wasn't born at Tabernacles, maybe he was born 2 months earlier. Well, there are knock-on effects, because the way you establish when he was born is you use the priestly cycle. We know the priestly cycle based on when the temple was destroyed. We can go back in time to identify when John the Baptist's father was serving in the temple and the angel spoke to him and told him he was going to have a son. And from that, they identified when Yeshua was born, and from that, they can identify when his birthday was. And all that points to tabernacles according to their theory. If you move his birthday back so that he was 30 years old, so that when he was doing all these things, not breaking Torah, you can't just move back a few weeks. You have to move it back 6 months, 24 weeks on the priestly cycle. And that completely breaks everything, because you shift John back by 6 months and you shift Yeshua back by 6 months. And now John, they're using Tiberius' 15th year, and that's when John starts his ministry. So John can't start his ministry until Tiberius' 15th, which now he's 30.5 years old. But that's the same time that Yeshua turns 30. So Yeshua can't be baptized before he's 30, if John can't even start his ministry until Tiberius 15th. And they can't move Tiberius 15th backwards anymore because they're already using the most extreme interpretation, which is that the first year of Tiberius starts 8 months before the co-regency even began. Okay, so that's, you can't move it back anymore. This is as early as you can go for counting the years of Tiberius. And so they can't move Yeshua's birthday back any. Or they're out of sync with the priestly cycle. And so it's just a dead end. So with all that factored in, he can't be declaring it 3.5 years before. And yeah, that's a big breakdown, because the whole theory is that the Jubilee was 3.5 years after, which of course in and of itself goes against Torah. So, so I just discussed the 24-week shift required and how it throws everything out. So the closest way to save their theory is to place Nazareth reading on the Day of Atonement in 29 AD, drop their 3.5-year theory, keep 30 AD as the Jubilee year, and Wednesday as the Passover, and Tabernacles as his birthday. The problem with this rescue attempt is that they now must reinterpret the Gospels to say that everything happened in 6 months, feeding the 12, sending out the 12 disciples, and all the stuff they did, and then coming back, feeding the 5,000, walking on water, and all the other things that occurred during feast and summer months. So that means they can't say 29 without ruling out 30 AD. Now that pushes them to 31 or 32, and that throws out Wednesday as the day, and so the whole Sabbath theory falls apart, and you can see the problem. The other scriptures also, the other Gospels also talk about him being rejected at Nazareth and help us order these events. And so, yeah, it's just an impossibility. So, is it a 49 or 50 year Jubilee cycle? So that's the key claim, is that it's 50 years long. And so they claim that Yeshua will return on a Jubilee and that the final Jubilee will be the Day of Vengeance. Now, I agree with them. The Day of Vengeance is on the final Jubilee, 25 AD. This year, we're going to have the fall of Babylon, sudden destruction. It is going to be a third of the world destroyed, and that's going to be his vengeance, is how it is described in Jeremiah. But they place that 3.5 years later. So the only evidence presented by Messiah 2030 for their Jubilee cycle is Yeshua's declaration. And we just showed how that would be totally against the law and actually impossible in numerous ways. So we've got a fundamental problem for the 50-year Jubilee cycle, because 30 AD and 2030 AD cannot both be a Jubilee year. Just mathematically, it's impossible. And of course, we have the 2 days as 2,000 years limitation, which mathematically cannot square with 50-year Jubilee, with Yeshua's death and return occurring on Jubilee years, exactly 2,000 years apart. Because of when it has to be declared, right? What I mean is, if he's dying on a Jubilee year, he had to declare it at least a year or two earlier than that in order for the timeline to work. And so you can't get him declaring it and then dying 6 months later. That's an impossibility, which means that there's at least a year or two between when he declared a Jubilee and the cross. And therefore, the cross cannot be a Jubilee year along with his return being a Jubilee year. So I have presented evidence that the Jubilee cycle should start when they enter the land, 1406. I guess I could expand on that a little bit more. Right? That's when they entered the land. And when Jericho fell, they blew the Jubilee shofars. That's what the actual Hebrew words, Jubilee shofar, had the word Jubilee and the word shofar, not one or the other. Your King James Version translates the word Jubilee as of ram's horns, but that's redundant. Shofar is ram's horns. So it's weird, but it's the last use of the word Jubilee in the scriptures is when Jericho falls. And Jericho falling is a parable or a similitude of the coming sudden destruction at the end. So that's why we're looking at second Passover. And then there were 6 years of war, and then the land rested. Right? And the book of Joshua states that the land rested twice after 6 years of war. So that tells you that the Shemitah cycle started when they entered the land, and that the first year was a Jubilee as well, because they blew the Jubilee trumpets to bring down Jericho. And that's a picture of what's going to happen when Babylon falls on a Jubilee at the last trump, right? The last Jubilee. And based upon this 7-year cycle, we can determine when in Yeshua's ministry the Sabbath year fell. So using my and the Pharisees in the book of Jubilees overlapping approach, the year 29 AD is the 7th year. And since we know that, we can rule out 30 AD as the year of the cross. Now, if you use the 50-year non-overlapping approach proposed by Messiah 2030, then the 7th year is either 23 AD or 30 AD. Well, 23 AD is too early, so that means he had to read it in 30 AD. Now, if he read it in 30 AD, then he can't be on the cross in 31, which means he must be 32 AD. And if it's 32 AD, then that means, using their theory of when the month starts, that Passover is on a Sunday. And a Sunday Passover is in no way compatible with Saturday Sabbath. So there is a major problem, since we've established when the cycle began with the book of Joshua, with the Jubilee trumpets being blown, and with the land resting after 6 years of war, which I think is a parable or similitude of the tribulation. We're going to have the Jubilee year, sudden destruction, followed by 6 years of war, right? That, like Daniel describes, that there's desolations are decreed until the end of the war. So there's a 6-year war during the tribulation, which is mirrored of the 6 years to gain their inheritance when they enter the promised land. Now, the land was given to them in the Jubilee year, but they had to go fight for it for 6 years. The tribulation is the same thing. We're going to get it this year, but we're going to have to fight for it for the next 6 years, right? He's going to take us, he's going to train us, and then we're going to come back with him, and we're going to fight the battle and win. That's how I understand it anyway. So, So since we know when the Shemitah cycle is on both things, right, my method and their method, we know which years during Christ's ministry qualify, and then obviously 30 AD is ruled out on all counts. Right? So, kind of covered all this stuff already. So, I already said you can't get 50-year Jubilee from the Jordan until 2095. And then, of course, Messiah 2030 already asserts that Genesis 6:3 and Moses' 120-year life indicates that a year is symbolic of a Jubilee. And the Lord said, "My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he is also flesh. His days shall be 120 years. So the time of mankind is 120 Jubilees, which they're saying is 6,000 years. And the problem with The 49-year Jubilee is that you're 120 years short from 6,000. And I can only conclude that those extra 120 years are before Adam sinned. I don't know how to account for it all, but there is nothing in Scripture that says that 6,000 years has to be evenly divisible into Jubilees. That's an aesthetic that us people that like round numbers use. But if you like round numbers, you don't do everything in sevens. That's a prime number that doesn't make things easy. So Messiah 2030 will claim that there's supposed to be 40 Jubilees, symbolic of the 40 years wandering in the wilderness from the cross until his return in 2030. So that's 2,000 years. That looks reasonable on the surface. Scripture doesn't say this has to be the case, but that's a nice parallel. But I can draw a similar parallel where there are 40 Jubilees that are 49 years each, which spans the destruction of the temple in 70 AD until the destruction of the abomination, the Dome of the Rock, in 2028. So either way, you've got 40 Jubilees in the wilderness. So the wilderness from when the Jews lost the temple, right? Now we're wandering aimlessly. We have no temple, no home. You're in the wilderness until the thing that's stopping you from building a new temple is destroyed. So I don't think that that's a conclusive argument on their point. But it is interesting that there have been 40 Jubilees that we've been wandering since the temple fell and sacrifices were ended. Interestingly enough, 3,000-year anniversary of Solomon starting to build the first temple is 2035, 7 years after the destruction of the abomination that sits in that very spot. So the abomination gets destroyed, and then 7 years later is the 3,000-year anniversary. I thought that was an interesting fact. Doesn't prove anything on its own right, but it's just interesting. All right, so I already covered 6,000 is not divisible by 49. So Messiah 2030 puts the cross at year 4,000 and the return at year 6,000. But by my calculations, 2025 has to be year 6,000 because we've got Daniel 9 that says that the end of the 4,900 years is, you back up 1,000 years and you get to the Jubilee that starts the millennial reign when he returns to meet us in the air. So 2025 is the year 6,000. Now, you go backwards. I already proved that you can't be exactly 2,000 years apart. And we get, let me go to my fun chart here. What we end up with is that Yeshua actually died 4,007. So it was the start of his ministry at the end of 69 weeks from the order to restore and rebuild Jerusalem that we entered into this 4,000-year age, and then he died on the first Shemitah, or 7 years into the 1,000. And he died exactly 1,000 years after David, which was in 3007. So David dies, and then 4 years later, the temple starts building, and then 7 years after that, you have a temple. Yeshua dies 40 years later, the temple is destroyed. And then 2028, you have Dome of the Rock being destroyed, and then shortly thereafter, Ezekiel chapter 40's Millennial Temple is going to be constructed and built, which could be as early as 2035. That might be when it's finished, or might be when it starts. I probably think that's going to start then and finish within 7 years. Though some people say we are the temple, and if we are the temple, then from the rapture until the temple is complete, 7.5 years. It fits being approximately 3,000 years from the first temple starting to be built. Anyway, those are how the numbers work out, is that if the year 6,000 is a Jubilee that lines up, then Yeshua dies at 4007, not 4,000. And what's interesting is the Abraham covenant, year 2100, is actually 3 times 700. So 3 times 700, 70 times 49, 70 times 7. You see all these nice round mathematical numbers that all fit into this perfect puzzle without really having to make it work very hard. So, covered that. So let's talk about Herod the Great, because so much of their entire theory depends upon when Herod dies to prove that Yeshua was born in 5 BC instead of 3 BC. That throws their whole timeline off by 2 years. Now there's this great video here. You can get a link. I'm going to summarize it briefly. But it more or less conclusively proves, in my mind, that Josephus' own words and there are other historians that Herod died in 1 BC. So I'm going to go real quick and talk about some of the key points. So Josephus dates Herod's appointment by Rome and the start of Herod's reign using multiple methods that are actually contradictory. So depending upon which statements of Josephus you use, you can either conclude that he was appointed in 40 BC and then he took over Jerusalem in 37, or that he was appointed in 39 and he took over in 36. Now, there are probably, now that I've studied it more, there are more than 3 different ways of using Josephus' own statements, independent statements, to derive 1 BC with a 39 and 36 BC start of rule. But there's only one way to get 40 or 37 BC for the start of Herod's reign. And it creates conflict with all the other references of Josephus and all other historians, and even the signs and the stars. Let's look at some of this for a second. So Josephus states that the destruction befell the city of Jerusalem when Marcus Agrippa and Gallus were consuls of Rome on the 185th Olympiad, on the 3rd month, on the solemnity of the fast, so Day of Atonement, as if periodical revolution of calamities had returned, since that was what befell the Jews under Pompey. For the Jews were taken by him on the same day, the Day of Atonement, and this was after 27 years' time. So Pompey, we know, was 63 BC. 27 years later is 36 BC on the Day of Atonement. All right, so this is Josephus' own words proving 36 BC. Now, people will try to claim, well, we're going to use inclusive counting, which would dump this back to 37. Inclusive counting is not a requirement, it's a choice of the interpreter. And so you have to consider everything else. Since you're talking about 2 things happening on the exact same day, so many years apart, it doesn't make any sense to use inclusive counting to talk about the interval between those 2 things. So inclusive counting is a necessity to support the 4 BC conclusion, but the text doesn't demand it. Then we have the following, also from Josephus. And thus did the government of the Asmoraeans cease 126 years after it was first set up. So from the book of Maccabees, 126 years later, 36 BC. So you have 2 things from Josephus that point at 36 BC. Okay, so now we have another historian which claims that the course of events in the consulship of, I'm not going to pronounce it, so during the following year, the Romans accomplished nothing worthy of note in Syria. So we know 38 is when this is. The following year would be 37. They did nothing. Conquering Jerusalem would be of note. So therefore, 36 is where the conquering took place. And then we have this other fact, also from Josephus, which says, according to the number of the high priests, so the count, from the times of Herod, right, so the start of Herod's rule, until the day when Titus took the temple of the city, so the second temple fell, which is in 70 AD, there were 28 priests, and also the time that belonged to them, so the cumulative time of the 28 priests, which tells you that it's not inclusive counting, was 107 years. Now, if it was inclusive counting, then it would be even worse for the 4 BC case, because this is on the other side. So inclusive counting would make it even worse. So 70 AD plus 107 years is 38 BC. Is the start of Herod. Then you go 3+ years, now he's conquering. So Herod was appointed by the Romans. He was a king without a kingdom. 3 years later, he conquered, and that's when he started actually ruling and minting coins. But before then, he didn't actually control Jerusalem, but he was appointed king. So that's why we have these different dates here. So that's a Josephus quote from a well-known date, the temple falling, until the start of Herod's reign. And then we've got more stuff from Josephus that connects it to so for in the 7th year of his reign, in the war about Actium, was at the height of the beginning of the spring. So at this time, so say in the 7th year of the reign of Herod. Well, now we can back this in with 37 years from 38 BC goes to 1 BC. I need to study that one a little bit better. And now this one, I think, is the icing on the cake. So we know that when Josephus was 15 years old, he was appointed a position as procurator of Judea. And this was done in the 9th year of this high priest. So we know when that high priest was 54 BC. That was the 9th year of that high priest. We know how old Josephus tells us Herod was on that date, and Josephus also tells us he was 70 years old when he died. So you can go from this back up 15 years, then go forward 70 years, and you end up with 1 BC. So how many different ways, in Josephus' own words, have we proven 1 BC? Right, we got from the temple's destruction, we've got from when he was born, and we've got these Pompeii falling to, so there's just like half dozen different references and day counts from well-established events that Josephus gives us that all work without using inclusive counting, and they all prove 1 BC as possible. Now, there's no way that you can interpret all of those same data facts with inclusive counting and the other years, because it falls apart and it doesn't work. So you have to ignore Josephus or consider Josephus wrong on a whole bunch of different things in order to support a 4 BC claim, which is what Messiah 2030 does. So, then people will claim, well, what about the rule of Herod's sons? Right? And this was something that I was stuck on for a while, because Herod's sons ruled for 10 years according to Josephus, and we know when their rule stopped, and we can go back to when they started, and it looks like it was 4 BC. Seems to make sense. Except we have Josephus also telling us that he made his sons king while he was still alive. So he appointed his sons to these various positions. They were king. They had authority in different regions, but they didn't have the authority to mint coins. There are no coins in the names of their son until 4 years after his reign. So there's 4 years where this guy's king of this region. He says that he was made king while he was still alive. And then immediately after he dies, bam, the first coins with him are found. There's no coins found beforehand. So the absence of coins suggests Herod was reserving that to himself. And once he died, his sons who were in the area were able to start establishing their reign. And one of the ways you establish your authority is to mint the coins. And so they were all competing to go to Caesar to get Caesar to ratify them as the new king. And of course, no one replaced Herod. Caesar left them all with their own individual regions, and no one had the whole region that Herod had afterward. So there was no succession to Herod as far as the entire kingdom. It was divided. And therefore, you're dating the reign of a different position. So he can have that position before his father died, and then continue to have it after he died. And there's no conflict there with that overlap. So that is how you handle one of the sons. And so then you have his other son, Philip. And when they went and they studied all the ancient texts of Josephus, the oldest texts, all of them before 1500 or so, they all say that his son Philip died in the 22nd year of Tiberius, backing up the 17 or however many years it was. And you end up with him taking over in 1 BC. But later transcripts or copies or scribal errors or whatever of Josephus have the 20th year of Tiberius, which then shifts it and makes it look like 4 BC. But the oldest documents, and there's a lot of them, they're all in agreement. And so that supports 1 BC. So using Josephus' own testimony and triangulating the start of Herod's reign from many, many different sources. And what I did, I'll show this in a future video, is I created a scale drawing of, a pixel, 100 pixels per year, a huge timeline. I laid all these facts going back and forth, the reigns, the differences, citing all the sources, all the quotes of Josephus, and laid it all out. And it all checks out that according to Josephus' own words and all the other historians, he died in 1 BC. And since that's such a huge pillar of Messiah 2030, it shifts everything 2 years on their timeline. It changes the year of Tiberius that they're interpreting. They'd have to move it by 2 years to have John the Baptist line up now. It shifts where the 3.5 years would be. It just shifts everything. So you get this one fact wrong, cascading consequences all the way down to the year of the cross, which then impacts when Sabbath can be. And so they end up on the wrong Sabbath. Conclusion. I've demonstrated that Messiah 2030 introduces a theory of Yeshua declaring a Jubilee on the Day of Atonement 3.5 years before the Jubilee year, contrary to Scripture. I've proven that by law, Yeshua would never break. He could not have been teaching in the synagogues and doing miracles in Capernaum as he was growing in fame before Nazareth. The other Gospels clearly indicate a rejection at Nazareth was not the first thing he did, and Yeshua's message in Nazareth references his prior miracles that the crowd had heard about. So therefore, he had to be 30 before these events, but this would force his birthday back precisely one priestly cycle, which in turn is no longer compatible with the most extreme interpretation of 15th year of Tiberius, and it's impossible for them to reinterpret it because they already used the earliest one. So I further demonstrate that if this declaration of Jubilee if it was a Jubilee declaration, as they assert, then the cross would have to be 6 months later, if the cross was a Jubilee year. And this is impossible given the time of events. So they're asserting that the Jubilee was declared 3.5 years early, contrary to the law. And lastly, I demonstrated at the very foundation of their timeline, the death of Herod is seriously inconsistent with dozens of statements of Josephus and other historians of the same period. So we are left to evaluate a subset of Josephus' statements that contradict the other historians and other statements from Josephus, and then apply inclusive counting where it doesn't make sense in order to assume a lunar eclipse that is hardly visible was more noteworthy than a full blood moon. So, in conclusion, Messiah 2030 is got so many things wrong. And I didn't even go through all the things I could prove about first fruits always being on the 16th of the month, and therefore their 3 days, 3 nights falls apart. But yeah, that's the summary. The exciting thing that we all need to be realizing is that this year, right now, we are in the millennial reign. And we've got a 6-year war ahead of us. And that 6-year war is nuclear, destroying 1/3 of the world. We need to pray that we are counted worthy to escape all these things, and that he will take us to him. And that's what he says he will do. So, very, very exciting times. There's this understanding of Daniel 9:24 and the 4,900 years for the seed of Abraham, I think is game-changing, on top of the 70 Jubilees from the Jordan River. It all fits like a hand in glove to tell a beautiful story, and that is supernatural. All right, I pray you guys have a great day, and I'll see you later.